Welcome everyone to our conversation this evening on the past and present state of Syria. I'm Dan Sheely, a lecturer here in the History Department and the Director of the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture. We coordinate a number of academic programs here, including special events like this one. And how bad is the echo? Fair. If you'd like to receive announcements for events like this one, we will have sign-up sheets circulating, so feel free to sign up. In addition to the study of the Catholic intellectual tradition, what the Institute promotes are broad-based conversations about fundamental questions and modern properties. That is, subjects that cannot be pursued as profitably by a single pen unit as they can be when multiple partners join the conversation. So I'm delighted to express my gratitude now to our many partners today who have come together to make this conversation possible. The Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations and the Middle East Center, the Alexander Hamilton Society, the Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society, the Foreign Policy Research Institute, PEN for Syrian Refugees and their friends and partners over at the PEN Muslim Student Association and the PEN Arab Student Society, PEN for UNICEF, Sigma Iota Rho, the International Relations Honor Society, which very graciously included us as part of the Global Ethics Day campaign that was being held today, October 16th, as well as the Penn Book Center and Oxford University Press. Thank you for coming with the books of our featured speaker, and I'm sure they will be thanking any of us who wishes to buy one. Finally, I'd like to thank and introduce our moderator, Professor Heather Sharkey, for her pivotal role in this event. Professor Sharkey is Associate Professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, affiliate faculty member of the Middle East Center, and a member of the Advisory Council of the Penn Humanities Forum, the support of all of whom we're very pleased to have. She received her PhD in History from Princeton University, as if nothing good ever came out of there, after earning her MPhil at the University of Durham on a Marshall Scholarship, and after earning her undergraduate degree at Yale, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, and everything else. Before taking up her post at Penn, she taught at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, at Trinity College, and at MIT. And she's not slowed down here either, winning Penn's Charles Ludwig Distinguished Teaching Award in 2011, and then traveling to Paris as the visiting professor of the École des Hautes Études, Social Sciences. She also writes and publishes. She is working, she's completed 2 monographs. The first, Living with Colonialism, Nationalism and Culture in the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. Her second, American Evangelicals in Egypt, Missionary Encounters in an Age of Empire. And we're very, very grateful that she's taken a break from finishing her third monograph on the relations of Jews, Muslims, and Christians in the modern Middle East. So I'd like to thank and welcome Professor Heather Sharkey.
So, Dan, thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this event. It's an honor to be here tonight to discuss this fantastic book on a very important subject. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce our speaker and also our discussant for tonight in turn. And our speaker is Sahner, who comes to us from reports to the Wall Street Journal, the Times, Literary Supplement, and an array of academic venues. He's received many fellowships, including fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Center for Oriental Research in Amman, and Jordan, and so on. So we're delighted to have Christian here tonight with us. It's a real honor and privilege, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk about a subject that concerns so many of us right now. Our discussant is Ron Granieri, who is currently Director of Research at Penn's Lauder Institute, as well as the Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. And for those of you who are not from Penn, the Lauder Institute, where he is the Director of Research, combines an MA and MBA degree program in international business for a very select group of Wharton students who specialize in Arabic and Arabophone and Lusophone and Francophone and so on in many different parts of the world. So it's a really dynamic program that we have here at Penn. He is a specialist in Cold War era Europe and has written extensively on this subject and on diplomatic history in the mid to late 20th century and early 21st century period. He's taught at Penn, Syracuse, Temple, and Furman universities. He was also at the University of Tübingen in Germany. He's been the recipient of many fellowships, including the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Fellowship. And I can also say that I've had a number of students over the years at Penn, advisees, who have told me that he is the best professor they've ever had. So, and these are my best students who have told me this. So I know that he's a really great professor, and Lauder is really lucky to have him right now. So thank you very much. And without further ado, I'll turn over the podium to Christian, and then Ron will speak and discuss for a while. We'll have a chance for questions at the end. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, thank you all for coming. It's great to be on enemy territory as a Princeton Tiger in Wonderland, but to see so many faces in the audience also. Dan Shealy, who is the director, who very kindly introduced Heather, is an old friend of mine from Princeton, I should say. So it's nice to see the strengthening of these relations between our two universities. I want to acknowledge several friends in the audience, including people from the Penn Cultural Heritage Center with whom I've collaborated on Syria research in the past, and are doing very, very important work to draw attention to the destruction of cultural heritage, which is maybe an issue that we can talk about in the question and answer. So thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to Heather for her extremely generous introduction, and thank you in advance to Ron for what I'm sure will be a very interesting and fruitful exchange. So the book that I've written is called Among the Ruins of Syria, Past and Present. It's a bit of a strange book in terms of its genre, in that it combines two elements that you don't typically find in books on the Middle East. My first goal was to give readers, general readers, a sense of the very, very rich and complex and beautiful history of Syria at a time when, as a country and as a civilization, Syria was dominating newspaper headlines in a way, and certainly in my lifetime and for decades and decades before. And yet, despite this attention in CNN and the New York Times, it was my feeling as a historian that, in fact, the public was missing out on the most important and most interesting parts of the story. And so it was this motivation, this desire to expose people to the bits of Syria's past that were being overlooked. That's what motivated the first bit, the history. My interest in Syria itself came out of experiences traveling there and living there in the years before the war. While I was a student at Oxford, I started traveling to Syria for Arabic study. At the time, the received wisdom was there were two great places to study Arabic. Only one of these is true today because of the situation in the Middle East. One was Cairo, which you can still visit and still study it, and the other was Damascus. And frankly, it was dumb luck that led me there. But in going, it changed my life in a way that I could not have imagined. And in a sense, this book is the fruit of those experiences that began over 7 years ago when I first touched down at Damascus International Airport. And so the second element of the book was memoir. And I use the term memoir hesitantly, knowing that on the cusp of my 30th birthday, that's a bit of an Arabic think, a memoir until well after they turned 30. But nonetheless, I wanted to give readers a sense of the, not just the rich history, but the texture of daily life. What did this country smell like? What were the scenes you would encounter as you passed through the streets? Who were the people that you met? And so the result was a book with a hybrid style. On the one hand, history. On the other hand, memoir, reportage, and travel writing. I'll leave it to you to decide whether it's successful. But at the very least, I hope it's rich and interesting. Of course, writing the book was motivated by events that have been unfolding in Syria ever since the war broke out in March of 2011 in the city of Daraa in the south near the Jordanian border. And given this tragic turn of events, it seemed an extremely important time, an opportune time, to reflect on the long-term historical trends that had not, per se, necessarily brought Syria to this particular moment in time, but which nonetheless provided a backdrop to the terrible course of events over the past few years. And so that was the motivation for writing the book. And in the process, I racked my brains and my diaries and my notes of my years in Syria and in the countries along its borders, asking myself, were there experiences that I had that could have in some way foreshadowed or anticipated the course of events as they've unfolded since then? There were many of these, but I want to begin my brief remarks by reading just an exchange I had with a friend of mine, and I think you'll quickly see why I bring it up at the beginning of my talk. I'll revisit it at the end, but I want to read it for you now and let it hang in the air for just a bit. To give you context, this is a conversation I had with a friend of mine, a guy roughly my age, a Sunni Muslim who was from Damascus. He's well-educated, enamored of American culture, American pop culture in particular. He knew much more colorful vocabulary of swear words than I did in English. And so we're sitting in an old cafe, a very famous cafe in the city of Damascus in the shade of the Umayyad mosque, which is the spiritual and historic heart of the old city. And we're discussing the election of President Barack Obama. It's the summer of 2009. And of course, what was on everyone's mind was the historic election of the first African-American president. Not just people here, but people around the world, including in Syria. So we were discussing diversity. He said to me, as an American, you like diversity. You have all these races and ethnicities in your country, even a black president. But what if diversity in my society isn't the same as diversity in yours? What if diversity here in my country and in this region is a source of weakness? Wasn't it diversity that created the violence in Iraq that we pressed on? The existence of all those different groups, Sunni, Shiite, Kurdish, Christian. I'd rather live in a place that did not have diversity, he told me, and was stable, than live in a diverse place that was at constant risk of falling into a civil war. As I said, I'll revisit this conversation at the very end of my talk in about 15 minutes. So the topic is not Syria's past, but where Syria is right now and maybe where it's headed. So I want to give you a rundown of what has happened over the past 3 years, what is happening currently, and what may be coming down the pipeline. And I do this not because you people are not well read. I'm sure many of you are reading many of the same newspapers and websites that I do to keep up with the Syria crisis. But it's my distinct impression that with all of these moving parts, it can be very difficult to perceive the forest amidst the trees when it comes to Syria. So this is a structural take on what has happened, what is happening currently, and what will, I think, happen in the future. So to understand the origins of the Syria crisis, I think you have to think about 3 specific axes of the conflict. The first and the original axis of the conflict is, of course, the domestic rivalry, the domestic animosity that emerged in early 2011 between the Syrian regime on the one hand and a loose coalition of opposition activists, and this changes over time. What is it that precipitated this internal domestic crisis? There are many things you can point to, but I think clearly the most important, the central, is the role of the Ba'ath Party and the authoritarian system that has been ruling Syria since the 1960s and under the Assad family since 1970. The current president, Bashar al-Assad, is the son of Hafiz al-Assad, who led an extremely gloomy, autocratic rule trained as an ophthalmologist, young and attractive, that he would usher in a new age, that he would rescue Syria from decades of gloomy Arab socialist rule. And indeed, at the beginning of his reign, the beginning of his rule as president in 2000, there was a brief period of openness that has since been called Damascus Spring. But as this openness spun out of control in the eyes of the regime, and in particular hurt the older elements that had been in place and survived and remained in place after the death of Assad, these reforms were quickly quashed, and in many respects, it was back to business as usual. A slight opening of the economy, which was a salutary change, was also accompanied by the development of a form of crony capitalism, in which on the one hand there was an opening of the economy, but many of the industries that were opened up to competition were placed in the hands of Assad family members and close affiliates of the family. The Arab Spring, which detonated in Tunisia in November of 2011 and quickly spread to countries like Egypt and Yemen and then to Syria, only fanned the flames and very, very quickly created conditions that were ripe for revolution by uncorking tensions that were ferocious, but largely unspoken of and invisible to the outside world. So this is the first axis, the domestic conflict within Syria between the regime and the loose coalition of opposition groups. And what is also significant about this axis is, of course, its turn from non-violence to violence. From the spiritual heart of the uprising being largely a civil society uprising premised on weekly gatherings, particularly on Fridays after the prayers, to a bloody conflict that was chiseled by long-standing lines of sectarian animosities. The second significant axis in the Syrian civil war is, of course, the regional axis. And here I'm speaking about the rivalry and animosity between Iran and Saudi Arabia and its allies. This was a local manifestation of a regional geostrategic conflict that long preceded the outbreak of fighting in Syria. And as such, it quickly drew in smaller groups, not just these major nation-state actors, but their local proxies. In the case of Iran, its Lebanese Shiite allies like Hezbollah, as well as various Iraqi militias. And on the part of Saudi Arabia and Sunni Gulf countries, various Sunni militant groups, from the Muslim Brotherhood to Al-Qaeda affiliates and many others in between. The third significant axis in the conflict, as I see it, is, of course, the global. And indeed, it's hard not to see what has happened in Syria at this level as, to some extent, a renewal of Cold War rivalries between Russia and the West. A renewal of Cold War rivalries that has struck many other theaters of conflict around the world, not just Syria, but I'm thinking of places like Ukraine. A renewed Cold War rivalry that pits, on the one hand, renewed Russian assertiveness on the world stage against what many characterize as potential retreat of American power, war weariness back home. Before leaving Russia and moving on, I think it's important to briefly comment on the distinction between Russia on the one hand and Iran, the two allegedly implacable allies of the regime in Damascus. I think we can get into this in the question and answer if it interests you. For Iran, I believe this is an existential crisis that they feel they must win. I think Russia's approach to what is happening in Syria, its staunch defense of the regime of President Assad, is more pragmatic, and it's premised on a range of other geostrategic considerations, not per se pegged to the person of Assad, not per se pegged to the spiritual axis at the heart of this conflict, but for other things. So that's how I see Russia and Iran being slightly different. So that's where we have been for the past 3 years. I want to turn now and talk about the present. And as I see it, the story of the present in Syria is largely a story of how Iraq impinged. In this respect, I'm speaking about events dating to this summer. For those who follow news more closely, events that have been happening for several months. And this is the explosion of the group that we now know as ISIS, the Islamic State. Their name seems to change every few months. And in particular, the manner in which they were drawn to the world's attention in the conquest of extremely important cities in Syria and Iraq. Raqqa, a major Syrian city on the Euphrates, Fallujah in Iraq, and significantly earlier this summer, Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, which they successfully conquered with stunning speed that shocked the world. The tragedies of the summer, the military tragedies of the summer were, of course, exacerbated and highlighted by a range of other things that took place. The mass exodus of minority groups from northern Iraq, including the Yazidis and Christians. To my eyes, it's important to understand ISIS as the child of many fathers, and this is a term I borrow from a very, very astute Lebanese journalist and essayist. His name is Ziad Majid. He says that ISIS is the child of 6 fathers. The first of these is the experience of U.S. occupation in Iraq. The second of these is the long history of despotism in Iraq, a despotism created and nurtured by the Saddam Hussein regime for many, many years, and subsequent to U.S. invasion, in particular, the gradual waning of the U.S. military presence to the Maliki government. The third father, according to Majid, is an aggressive and proselytizing form of Iranian sectarianism that has spread its way across the Middle East, against which groups like ISIS are reacting. The fourth is their own ideology, that of an ascendant and aggressive Gulf Salafism. The fifth is a puritanical view of the past, a desire to restore a perceived moment of glory in the past of Islamic history and bring it into the present. And the sixth and most striking, and has arguably moved the world to act against ISIS in a way that no other tragedy in the course of the past 3 or 4 years in the Middle East has, is a tremendous appetite for violence. To my eyes, however, what makes ISIS extremely unique are 3 things. The first is the much trumpeted re-establishment, or claim to re-establish a caliphate, which coincided with their conquest of Mosul and also coincided with the holy month of Ramadan. I think the word caliphate is bandied around a lot in the news today. You don't have to look far in your Google search to find this fairly esoteric Arabic word caliph popping up. The caliphate, for those of you who don't know, is essentially the paradigmatic, the original, the ideal form of Islamic government, established by the successors of Muhammad after his death in the year 632. And it was under a series of important and very powerful dynasties of caliphs that Islam initially spread in that early Islamic period, spread from the Atlantic coast of Morocco all the way to the Hindu Kush, modern Central Asia, and modern Pakistan. And so, over the years, the nature of this caliphate, especially the unitary nature of the caliphate, the idea that it ruled this vast swath of territory in the person of a single sovereign, this collapsed, but as an ideal, as a notional ideal to which Muslims aspired, it has always remained. And indeed, the legal dissolution of the caliphate in the 1920s under Ataturk, the founder of the modern state of Turkey, according to many historians, left a gaping hole in the spiritual life of many Muslim communities around the world. By that point, the caliphate was no longer a political power, but had tremendous spiritual resonance. And to dissolve the caliphate in the eyes of many of these groups was the equivalent of the dissolution of the papacy for Roman Catholics. And so, even if the restoration of the territorial caliphate was perceived by many Muslims, as I said, as implausible, the notion of the restoration of the caliphate had tremendous spiritual and cultural resonance. And therefore, ISIS, in claiming to reestablish the caliphate, has perhaps not succeeded in winning Muslims worldwide to their cause, but it's very, very clear that they have tapped into historical experience that remains in the eyes of many. And we can obviously discuss this in the question and answer. So the caliphate is one thing that makes them extremely unique. And it's important to note also that ISIS, although in one manifestation of an ideology of transnational jihad that we know through groups like so-called Al-Qaeda Central, what also makes ISIS unique, deeply connected to their vision of restoring the caliphate, is they make territorial claims. Territorial claims has not been a significant part of their ideological processes. The second thing that makes them unique is that ISIS has profited from the chaos and the bedlam created by the Syrian civil war without really participating in it. So there are many extremist groups that you can read about in the newspapers, etc., who ideologically may not be so different from ISIS. But what makes ISIS unique, as I said, is that they profit from the Syrian civil war without necessarily participating in it. Their primary goal, and of course their resistance has, as I said, grabbing territory and holding, not per se confronting the primary enemy in the eyes of many of their allies, namely confronting the Assad regime. And the third thing that makes them unique, and this looks beyond ISIS themselves, is that ISIS as a phenomenon has upended many of those tidy distinctions that I spoke about a few moments ago. The notion that the Syrian civil war can be mapped onto a series of axes: Syrian regime versus Syrian opposition, Iran versus Saudi Arabia and its allies, Russia versus the United States. These fairly tidy series of distinctions have been completely upended by the emergence of a shared threat in the form of ISIS. So now that we've talked briefly about the immediate past, as well as the present, I want to tell you about at least what I see coming down the pipeline. And I should underline that when I speak, I do not speak as an expert in policy, I don't speak as an expert in politics, I speak as a person interested in these things, but certainly not an expert. I speak as a historian. And so what I suggest may be coming down the pipeline, I suggest on the basis of having studied the past, not just this near past, but in the distant past, and trying to anticipate patterns that may be to come. The first thing I see happening is, unfortunately, while of course all of us would like to see President Obama succeed, it's my opinion that this will be a tough uphill battle. The reason I think this is that it seems from the outside that there is a high potential for mission creep, but more importantly, the deep ambiguity about precisely what that mission is. What does the U.S. have to accomplish in Syria? Depending on different statements that we read from people in Washington, it's to degrade and destroy. Sometimes it's to degrade, sometimes it's to destroy, and a range of other options. If it's to destroy, and once again, I don't speak as an expert in military matters, it seems obvious to me that this will require a commitment of resources, military, political, diplomatic, etc., that is far beyond anything we can mobilize to this point. And I think as a matter of economics and public interest, it will be very hard for President Obama to do that. If, on the other hand, the goal is to degrade, to incapacitate but not destroy and eliminate ISIS, that perhaps is a more manageable goal. But I think that it's less politically palatable goal for many in Washington and many of the capitals with whom President Obama is working on this. So I think that's one thing that is headed down the pipeline. In other words, the high potential for mission creep, and hopefully a clearer definition of our interests and our projects in Syria. The second thing that I see coming down the pipeline, connected to the first, is that President Obama will have an extremely difficult time as a result of the fragile consensus that currently propels the United States mission in the Middle East. There are explicit allies in the Middle East, and here these are countries like the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Turkey, a more hesitant ally, Jordan, etc. And then there are a range of tacit allies in the United States operation against ISIS. And here we're thinking about groups that may fall on the other side of U.S. policy with respect to the Assad regime, Iran and its allies, but at least for the time being, fall on the same side of U.S. policy with respect to ISIS. And it seems to me that the things that drive this coalition, explicit and implicit, apart, are far more powerful than the things that draw them together. And that in the long term, if not in the short term, this very fragile consensus is destined to fray and to explode. I think this in particular for the third thing that I see happening, namely the inevitable and tragic rehabilitation of President Assad on the world stage. Every day that the United States and its allies run missions over Syria, it seems obvious that the person who benefits most is the regime that President Obama and many of his allies have had the stated goal of removing for the past 3 years. In other words, there are many hostile groups operating inside of Syria, some of which are politically unpalatable to the United States, like ISIS, like Jabhat al-Nusra, and there are many that are completely unpalatable, that are palatable in this so-called moderate opposition groups. But in pummeling any number of these groups that stand opposed to President Assad, President Assad stands tame. And I think furthermore, his rehabilitation on the world stage, while tragic, also reflects the politics of realpolitik. It reflects the notion and the gradual understanding that you already see happening that, however unsavory it may be, to deal with the regime that has killed countless tens, hundreds of thousands of people and sent countless millions fleeing the country, that this is nonetheless a regime that one can interface with, that has institutions, that holds a seat at the United Nations, that can notionally enforce its treaty obligations, uphold its treaty obligations, etc. So I predict the near term, if not certainly much sooner, rehabilitation of President Assad on the world stage. The fourth thing that I think is important is, for an American audience in particular, the 2016 presidential elections. President Obama has committed himself to several years of statements about the necessity of removing President Assad, chemical weapons, and red lines. And I think that the nasty soup of things that are mixing in Syria and Iraq currently will force the next president, who will not be committed to the same range of statements, to make choices that President Obama never was able to. So I think it's very possible that whether a Republican or a Democrat is in the White House next, 2016 will bring about a possible reset on U.S. policy in the Middle East in terms of who we will work with, who we will not work with. And here I want to conclude by why I think all of this is tragic. It's not hard to track down things that are tragic in Syria today, but I want to focus on two. On the one hand, I think it is good that the world's attention has been turned to Syria and to Iraq. There have been incredible sadness, loss of life, bloodshed, human rights abuses in those countries over the past years that the world has largely turned a blind eye to. And suddenly we are paying attention. But in a strange way, attention paid to ISIS has also turned our attention away from what I perceive and understand to be the first order problems in a place like Syria. To reiterate those, like you said, rampant human rights abuses, mass casualties of civilians, countless millions of refugees who churn on Syria's borders and inside the country, internally displaced, human rights abuses, etc. Many of you know these things. And in a world in which ISIS is a first-order threat to the United States and its allies, those tragedies are currently being forgotten. And that is a horrible thing. The second tragedy, and this goes back to the quote that I read you at the beginning of my talk, and this is an issue that's particularly close to my heart as an historian and someone who studies the roles, the existence of religious and cultural diversity in the Middle East throughout the centuries. To my eyes, what is taking place in the Middle East today, in particular with the rise of these extremist groups and the political instability brought about by these civil wars, represents the latest and certainly an accelerated, and I'd be very fearful to say, but would not be incredulous to know, the final stage of a process of cultural homogenization that has been taking place in the region for over a century. This is a story that extends long beyond the exodus of Yazidis from Sinjar Mountain, which we all read about this summer. It's a story that long precedes the exodus of the Christians of Mosul. It's a tragedy that long precedes the Lebanese Civil War, the sectarian fighting in Iraq. It's a story that goes back to population exchanges in the wake of World War I. It's a story that goes back to the exodus of Jewish communities, Armenian communities, and Greek communities. And I should be very, very careful to also emphasize that this is not a story that is merely affecting minorities. It is also a story that is affecting Muslim communities across the Middle East. Over the course of the past decades, we have seen terrifically diverse cities such as Baghdad and Beirut, where Sunnis and Shiites live side by side, neighborhoods along with Christians and others. We have seen many of these neighborhoods and cities gradually segregated, such that members of one religious community live essentially among themselves. Neighbors and former neighbors now live isolated in other communities. So accelerated under pressures created by ISIS, accelerated under pressures created by the Syrian Civil War, we are seeing certainly the next chapter, and I fear perhaps one of the last of this gradual process of cultural homogenization in a world that, over the course of centuries and millennia, has actually been terrifically diverse, and much more diverse than I think many people in the United States actually realize. So this brings me back, of course, to that conversation I had with my friend in Damascus in 2009 as we were talking about President Obama. In 2009, long before this conflict began, although of course whispers of it existed in Syrian society. I think my friend perceived a course of events that seemed plausible at the time. In fact, when I look back on that conversation, aspects of what he said seemed repugnant to me. What was admirable and frankly amazing about Syria was, in contrast to places like Lebanon and Iran, countries on its borders that shared its spectacular diversity, Syria was a place where diversity had not overcome a level of accord and a level of peace within civil society among all these sects. This was not only a narrative that was imposed from top down by the government, but I think there was something authentic about the manner in which all of these groups, certainly in a very big city like Damascus, did live side by side. The word for this in Arabic is aish mushtarak, which essentially means conviviality, the capacity to live together. And what I find striking about that conversation in hindsight was how, despite many Syrians on the eve of the war adamantly denying the existence of sectarianism, adamantly denying the existence that religious identity was significant and created cleavages in society, that my friend in private, and I suspect many of us who visited Syria on the eve of the war, and many Syrians who certainly lived there before, would have said, although this was a taboo subject in public, it was something that people anticipated and discussed and hotly debated in private. And so that conversation makes me extremely sad, but in a way, as you can see, it has anticipated the course of events in Syria and the broader region over the past few years. So with that, I'm going to make my remarks and invite on to come up. So thank you very much.